Welcome back, everybody, to our penultimate session. And it falls into the block of work integrated learning and also workforce learning. We've just heard from Jerry on a whole host of examples, templates, and ideas of how portfolios can be used, not just by students, but also by faculty, administrators, and also employers, so that the story about an individual, but also the efforts of an institution can be told. And so I think that was a good pre-conversation that we've had now for the conversation that Schibeci from Macquarie University in Australia, and specifically in Sydney, is going to lead us into now, before we then conclude with, well, where can everybody else share their stories in APR? Over to you, Sue.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Jerry, also for sharing your work, because I think a lot of my questions might be answered by your resources, your open resources, which is really encouraging. But what I am at Macquarie University, and what is happening is that there's going to be a revamp of the work integrated learning offerings. Before I start, though, it's our tradition to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country that I am on, which is the Wallumattagal people of the Darug Nation. And I'm very conscious that as universities, as education institutions, that education tradition has lasted for tens of thousands of years in Australia. So we should be really conscious that this is, we're just continuing a wonderful tradition of education on this land. So what I wanted to do is basically get advice, because this is a totally new offering for work integrated learning. So just about Macquarie University, just trying to, sorry, just excuse me for a second while okay, so about Macquarie, we're about 40,000 students, not huge like Terry was talking about, but just one campus with about 40,000 students. And what we have is a compulsory work integrated learning for every undergraduate student. This has been here since about 2018. No, earlier than that, 2008. So very long tradition of compulsory work integrated learning for every student. Traditionally, those units, as we call them, or courses, have been run through faculty and supported by administration, which is what I'm part of within the Graduate Futures team. Of course, like every institution, probably internationally, we've gone through a very significant reduction in all sorts of significant work changes. So academics have lost their jobs, professional staff have lost their jobs also. So there's been a reduction of staff, but these offerings continue. So the consequences of the compulsory WIL model, which is known as PACE here, PACE, it's our professional and community experience, is that because they've been they have been administered centrally, but they've been run in different faculties, is that there's been inconsistencies in experience. So, for example, some students would have 30 hours as opposed to 100 hours of experience within their workplace or work integrated learning. Also, inconsistencies in assessment. So students would have essays or exams, would you believe, or reports, presentations, viva voce, those sort of types of things. So it's just, and if students spoke amongst themselves, they wouldn't have that consistency of what the experience was. So it was decided that across the university, we would continue offering this compulsory work integrated learning, but it would shift to an interdisciplinary team-based project provided by partner in organisations. So students would enrol in shell courses, which because of assessment, because the LMS is married to the LMS and assessments, each would be overseen by a faculty. So one unit for each faculty. There's a plan to get a whole lot of partners involved, and students would be assigned to these projects, which would fall under a range of themes, I guess. So there'd be projects on policy, on innovation, those sort of themes, depending on what the project is proposed. So teams of proposed 5 students, perhaps, from each of the faculties or mix of faculties would come together in the team. And so the hope is that all students would experience the consistency in learning and assessments. So we're devising a curriculum and syllabus that is consistent and will be offered to all students. So the way it will be delivered is that there'll be online modules to deliver foundational skills and knowledge, which the students will bring into the classroom and be able to use within the team setting. That classroom learning will come from that foundation of the modules and hopefully be able to use it in a practical sense, okay, in a team setting. And assessment suite will include, from my perspective, and disappointingly, some very traditional assessments, such as an essay and a presentation at the end, which could be bad, could be good, but the centerpiece will be an ePortfolio. So this is where I'm asking advice and the way to do it, because it is a significant portion of the assessment suite. Now, some of the constraints, and this is one of the things that makes it difficult, is that executive at the university has said that the ePortfolio will be on Adobe Express. So there's no two ways about that. It has to be submitted using Adobe Express. Now, Adobe Express is, I'm sure people have had some experience of it. It's very beautiful. It can be very creative for the students, but it's quite restrictive. And Jerry was talking about this openness of the experience and being able to share. And I'm very conscious that once the students leave the university, if they want to continue using Express, it will be very expensive for them. A bit of training is needed to use this, and that's fine. That'll be embedded into the upfront online modules. And it's easy to use, fairly intuitive, But there are some tricks that we need to train the students and be aware of. The ePortfolio, though, is thought of as a summative assessment task. So what they will do, what the students will do at the end is submit it as an assessment task to be marked by a large number of academics, casual academics, with different ideas, different perspectives, and different disciplines. Okay, so the underlying perception is that this is a time-saving activity for teachers and instructors. And from my perspective, from my experience, and I'm sure from everybody else's experience, it's not very time-saving insofar as they take a long time to mark if you want to actually get them get the gist of what the student is trying to say, and taking into account their creativity, taking into account their ideas, their discipline. It's not going to save a lot of time. So I feel that the constraints are the use of Adobe Express. That the weight of the assessment is about 50%, so it will be high stakes for the students. The individuality of the task, but it also needs the uniformity of some criteria. So, Jerry's resources will help with that, I'm sure. So, but these I perceive to be what are going to be some of the barriers to implementing this. Now, basically, I'm really at the end of what I wanted to present. So, we can finish early, very early, sorry. But what I wanted to do is how we can implement this and what suggestions anyone has. And I am very conscious that people are it's really late at night, and so that that you may not have be able to consciously do things, so it's fine. But any comments later on, I can be contacted. But so what I wanted to implement is like a real-time sandpit. So where the students can contribute evidence, artifacts, reflections as they go along, and use that final summative assessment as the final curated piece that they might submit for final marks. The idea with this is for the academics or the tutors to help the students along within this sandpit, to help them with anything that they can, any directions that they can find that the student might be lacking in, or help, or anything like that. The use of AI for helping with feedback. Now, Christina has often presented on things like RIF at Stanford. So this has been something that I've been working with, but also within the institution, AI suites. And how do you mark this double approach? So, of course, it's summative, but marking and marking criteria for this sandpit area. So as to not waste time, to save time, and to give students a rich feedback during their time and the process. And I like the idea of the storytelling that this could promote, that students can give their tell their own story within a diary type situation, where they could uh, process any information that comes or that any experience that they have and fit it within their learning journey within the experience. So that's sort of all I had to talk about. And I realize I'm very early, but I just wanted to get some ideas. If anyone has any, or I've sent you to sleep.
Oh no,
And you're ready to
definitely
go to bed.
don't send us
Yeah.
to sleep, Sue,
Oh no, but
because
I mean the
this is
east coast of the United States. Come on,
yeah.
bedtime.
This is a conversation session, so you finishing at
Yeah.
this time is actually really, really perfect because that gives us enough time to look more deeply into the questions you have and ideas that people have. So Jerry picked up on the sandpit. Jerry, do you want to voice what you had put into the chat?
Sure, sure. Um, so first, thank you, Suzanne, for your presentation and the challenges that you're facing. And I'll say I've experienced many of the things that you are, so my empathy is there with you. All right. Um, so what I have here is that you know, feedback to students is an effortful process, right?
Mm,
And if you're trying to reduce the faculty workload, um, that one of the things you can look at is having students provide peer-to-peer
yeah,
feedback at milestones throughout the process. And there are two things that happen. Well, the first thing, you have to have a good rubric that the
yeah.
students know how to apply, right? But but by evaluating other people's portfolio, they also learn about how they can make their portfolio better because they understand the criteria of evaluation, right? So and the students, so they're learning in the process and they're providing feedback so other people are learning. And but I'll just say the key in doing peer-to-peer, formative feedback here is you have to structure it so that they do it in a timely manner, and you have to have um, guidelines as to how you give your feedback, right? That's all, because and they'll learn, and they'll get better at it, and it's better to have um, small, frequent ones than really big ones to do that.
Mm,
So there might be different as they develop. So one of the things we did with ePortfolios is we have people develop ePortfolios in a modular process, right? So in the first week, they say XYZ, and then the second week it's another topic, and then you allow feedback in small modules, but peer to peer can be very, very effective there.
Yeah, I do like the idea of peer feedback because, as you say, it's really powerful for them to understand criteria, as well as that learning process and getting new ideas. And that's what it's all about, I think. What strikes me though is I guess they would have to, within that modular process, or each uh, time that students would do this, uh, the students would have to submit another curated type of portfolio with the marking or the criteria for that particular time, um, and still bring it from like a sandpit to a curated area. What are your thoughts on that?
Uh, I'll just say, so if you have a staging area of practicing, and then you have the production side of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah,
that's kind of a good one. It can complicate it a little bit if the tools for staging are different than the tools for production, right? So if they're
yeah,
using Adobe um, in both times, then they're getting practice at doing both, and then they can migrate one to the other pretty easily.
Yeah.
And having a staging area allows them to be more playful and try things out. And I'll just say the other thing I found about trying to get people to do e-portfolios is the hardest thing is get started, right? Oh no,
Indeed, I agree with you.
right, right. So if you have little things to get them started, then they can develop some momentum on that. So, yeah.
Mm. Yeah, because I like your ideas of the 5 Rs, and that's what that staging area would be, and moving it to this new, or to the production area.
Right.
That's where they would do the 5 Rs to the staging area, which is a nice concept, actually. I like that.
Yeah.
And also speaking of rubrics, Gail, you had put into the chat expanding the feedback loops. Do you want to expand a bit on that?
Basically, yeah, thank you, Christina. Basically, it was the same thing Jerry suggested, right? I mean, when I was using portfolios and we evaluated on any given year, about 3,000 student portfolios. And the only way that we could get through that was to bring peers in and have peers review. The other, and the loops would also then encourage you maybe to bring in, since this is a work integrated learning piece, to bring in employers.
Yeah.
Employers are often hungry to support their alma mater in many cases, or, just be part of the college experience. And they'd, love to, many talk to me over the years, they would love to be participating in that. So,
Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's a lot of, I guess, discussion about bringing in the partners as, so of course they're expected to give feedback, but having that any formal part in feedback is a discussion piece amongst work integrated learning practitioners. So, but I think it's really important, as you say, because as Jerry was talking about earlier, bringing the partners in to devise learning outcomes, I think is really important, because they're the ones that are trying to help the university make the students employable, and they've got the ideas of what the skills needed are within the workplace. So yeah, it's a really nice idea, and try to structure that in a really good way is something to think about. Thank you.
and there's authenticity in that too, right? I mean, that
Absolutely.
is, we always talk about portfolios and we talk about audience. That ultimately is the audience for this. So,
Indeed, because that's you want the students to be able to evidence that they've practiced a particular skill, or they've done this particular experience to help them with their employability. So yes, exactly. Thank you.
And maybe just to add on to that, how do you get employers to dedicate their staff to do this? And this is where I'll just say an MOU between the institution and the organ and whoever the commercial partners are, so that it becomes a strategic priority of management, and then management will allocate funding for someone to spend, I'm just making up numbers, 2 hours a week on supporting the education to employment pipeline type thing, right? And then they have to, that then becomes part of their job. And some of the challenges, I'll just say, often the employees then have to get paid on what's called indirect charges rather than direct contract charges. So the company has to be making enough money where they have some flexibility to do that, or they can do volunteer work if they don't have as part of their paid, that they can do volunteer stuff, and they have, and I've done that too as well. Um, and that could work out, but you have to support the volunteers with guidance and support and all that other stuff. But I think, and I'm not sure who 156. I don't know your name. Who's in Ohio? I
Oh
who
no,
made
the
the
number that is Gail.
Gail. Okay, yeah. Gail's point really important. Because this can provide that opportunity where they get to understand how higher education works. And
Yeah.
then they sometimes become less a critic and a less knowledgeable critic when they become more knowledgeable about how we have to do things.
But
Yeah.
you
And
have to
that's what,
you
yeah,
have to
sorry.
make it easy on them.
Yeah,
Because
that's
when I
right.
tried to do it, it was too difficult. And even I didn't want to participate, and I was running the program. So it has to be easy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you make it easy, for example, Gail? What have ideas have you had? So, a list of criteria, that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, for one, as many have said before me, make sure there's a rubric, make sure there's no
Yeah.
barrier to entry, right? It's got
Yeah.
to be easy for them to click a link and look at the portfolio. They don't want to have to be hunting around for this or that or anything like that. It has to be the things that they're evaluating, the things on that rubric have to be easy to find. And
Mm.
I don't know that, if you make it easy enough, if you give them a good rubric and no barriers to accessing the portfolio, you probably don't need a training session. These are smart people, hopefully. Um, and, but maybe a little video and tutorial or something like that. But yeah, I don't think it needs to be difficult what you're asking them to do.
Yeah, and I think the idea of a memorandum of understanding, this is part of the agreement, and we do spruik it as a pipeline to new graduates to workforce. So, and a lot of organisations are really happy to embrace that. So yeah,
Yeah.
and trying to get that to three-way benefit is a good thing. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. And I'll just
I
say, if you need to get people, have food and drink
I know
and
that costs.
I know, but it pays,
I know,
it pays to build the personal
I know.
relations. So, you know,
I agree with that because I mean it pays for with students, it pays with
yeah,
partners in all sorts of situations. So
yeah,
I do think when I was at Portland State and we did the kind of like we did the kind of assessment, it was a camaraderie, right? It was faculty that didn't get to see each other very often and making it sort of a celebratory space of look what our students can do.
yeah.
yeah.
I know it's a limited audience, but has anyone experienced something of this scale? And I know, there's lots of different scales, but, so uniform and across institutions. So any thoughts on that?
We've got a newer initiative at Ohio State to have at least 80% of our students participate in some sort of internship. So we actually have a new center that's a little bit distant from the area where I work, but they are kind of grappling, I think, with some similar types of questions. And I do think that ePortfolio could be a really useful way to help students think about kind of what they are what they are learning from the experience. And as others have mentioned, I think employers would be really interested in kind of the feedback to them about what the students are taking away from it. I was wondering also if there might be existing pieces to that work integrated learning experience where you might be able to fold in some discussion around a student portfolio. So for example, if the employers are having regular check-ins or discussions with the students, could that portfolio become part of that discussion? So it maybe doesn't feel as much like here's this extra thing that you're doing, but rather the portfolio can kind of enhance those discussions that you're having with these students.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Corey, because I think trying to impose more and more time on these people that are essentially they're volunteering. I mean, they're employed, but they are volunteering to help our students. I think the only thing is that the vision is that per project, and there'd be one partner per project, there'd be 40 students, which I think is quite large. So how to curate, well, I guess curate or put it down to, a more doable level, but doing it during those sessions would be ideal. Yeah.
Kind of putting my employer hat on. As we do have annual performance reviews and things like that. And yes, the interns might not be there for the entire time, but we do also check in with them on a regular basis. And so the portfolio could be some of that pre-work that the students create the portfolio, which they need to create for the university already anyway, and then share that link with the mentor supervisor. And maybe the mentor does not necessarily give feedback on the portfolio, but they use that as basis for their conversation of how's the internship going. And it might not even be the mentor, but it could be a group that gets together. So if a workplace has multiple interns, then it might be somebody from the people team, or it might be another person might be a peer in a young staff member who have regular check-ins. And so use the portfolio as that evidence to then talk about it, because we don't have to talk about the portfolio only online on the portfolio, but it can spark further conversation. And so
no, it's a good idea.
I do want to do a quick shout out to Old Dominion University because Elle was here. Elle Tyson was here during the entire day and just only dropped off because she and also in particular Megan Mize are involved in two initiatives at ODU. One is the Monarch Humanities Internship Academy, where they are looking into setting up about 750 internships for humanities students and using portfolios in that. So that I think is an initiative. That doesn't cover the entire university, but it's quite large scale, I would say, kind of getting so many internships going that I think would be a good one to take note of and have a check with Megan what they are doing. In order to see how that could also be replicated elsewhere, because of course they are setting up a program that they can then sustainably keep at the university after the project is over.
Yeah, and sustainability is a really key point because it's no good just setting it up for one particular learning session. We need it to go forever. Supposedly, at least the last offering for work integrated learning here was, almost 20 years. So, having that longevity is something that is needed, and creating the energy for people to sustain it. So, yeah, that's good. Yeah, I should talk to Megan again about that.
Debbie, I know that you have the student portfolio showcase, and I'm I think it might have been Helen who told me also about other showcases where the students, currently, of course, mainly online, have online sessions and then talk about their portfolios, and employers are also invited to join. Do you have, does something like that also exist at Indiana University, Indianapolis? Because you do have the ePortfolio studio and work quite a bit with students in different areas of portfolio practice.
What we have had is an undergraduate research day where community partners, family and friends, and people looking to hire hot talent can come and see student work. And so, like, Life Health Sciences internship that Brandy Gilbert has led will have this time they had 120 students in one room with all their laptops up, and some artifacts on their tables around their work. And they had chances to meet with um, prospective employers. We do have then days where we bring employers to campus, and we've started encouraging students to put QR codes to their ePortfolio on their resume, as well as having business cards with a name and a QR. So there's those kinds of things. And then on a micro level, I know two different departments that for internships bring employers in. The employers interview all the students for the internship positions, and then they negotiate and divide them up, and the faculty members there, and it all happens in one day. Um, and many times those kinds of internships and or co-op opportunities evolve into job opportunities. But not all of these things have ePortfolios, but they should. So
Yeah, exactly. I mean, how else do you demonstrate that you're fit for this particular, and what's better than an ePortfolio of your practice and your learning and your skill development?
absolutely. And the thing that I am lacking in is things like Luis Ricardo shared earlier. So we're trying then, as we work with faculty to implement ePortfolios, is to ask them to please use their expertise to help us figure out what's working and crunch the numbers and those kinds of things. And hopefully that helps some students along the way as well.
Yeah.
And Corey put into the chat that student employees in the Honors and Scholars Center at the Ohio State University complete a scaffolded portfolio as basis for discussion with their supervisor. That's on a much smaller scale, though, but maybe just a couple of dozen students, but that definitely is a good starting point to see if that works for them, and then extrapolate that and go into different departments as well. Because I always find it's good to start small. Have a few students, have worked with one or two enthusiastic faculty or tutors or work integrated learning supervisors. It's so that you have a good starting point rather than have everybody in there and then competing priorities. And maybe one person is not as enthusiastic, who then kind of takes away the attention from what good can be done, so that you develop some good examples of what is possible. To the point that Debbie had made earlier, yes, the portfolio showcase that Indiana University, Indianapolis has lots and lots of portfolios, but not all of them are necessarily examples that showcase the very good aspects of it. And so that exemplars are good to have, so that students know this is kind of the yardstick that I want to measure myself against or look more towards rather than something else. And really work with faculty that are enthusiastic, that want to implement this practice, work with a small number of students to see, well, how can we do this? And then grow from there.
Yeah. And I think as the point I think we were discussing earlier about having very clear rubrics and guidelines and would help with that, even if it's at scale. So yeah, that's other sort of parts that are are being developed too. So in a sense, it's a very exciting time, but very scary, and there are lots of constraints because executives have ideas and they don't have experience in this either. So their ideas may not quite align with what the reality is.
So earlier you had mentioned that you are a bit constrained by the tool that you are asked or that the students are asked to use. What Jerry had talked about earlier be of use where you do develop some basic templates so that students do have that structure that their portfolio use is scaffolded and they don't have to learn the tool inside out, but at the start, at least focus on certain aspects and then grow from there.
I think that's probably the way we need to go. It's always a tug of war for me because I feel as if I'd like them to be creative rather than being constrained. But I know they can be creative within a particular, with guardrails to just, and that assists with marking, assessment, all of those sort of things, and knowing that they've actually put in what needs to be put in and can be marked. Yeah.
Yeah, I find sometimes the constraints actually allow you to be creative because kind of in the context you operate and you can think about that rather than thinking too widely and not really knowing where to start and where to stop and where the other person wants to go. And so, yes, while templates might be restrictive, I always actually look at them as more of an invitation to start. So it's kind of like you build a house and you provide the frame. So you have a door, you have the windows, and you have the roof and all of that. But whether the door is red or green, or what sort of floor you have, what the inside layout is, how many rooms you have, how you want to paint them, and all of that, that is still up to you. So you do know kind of essentially how much budget you have in a way and what your plot of land is, but you still have a lot of possibilities to be creative, be yourself, and express yourself in the way that you want.
Yes. Yeah, and I agree. And I know that I'm probably stereotyping, but some disciplines will, or students in some disciplines will want the bare minimum of written listing, whereas some other students, and perhaps in the same project, which is what's quite exciting, will be liberated, I guess, by that they can be creative within this, and that it's to own it for themselves and stamp their individuality. So yeah. Hand up, Stevie's.
So I'm 100% against templates, and we build them for every faculty member that wants them, because they are an entry point. And I love the way, Christina, the way that you were framing that house, but that concept. Oh, I'm getting ready for Shark Tank. I want 2 good puns. I'm not very fast with puns. I'm going to prep at least 2. But in my class, what we were doing is we'd all just pick the same Wix template, although that's gotten really complicated now that Wix is leaning into AI. And I would just say you need these 3 tabs, right? But we wouldn't do it till they had something to put in it, right? So then we would build out one of the tabs, and then there'd be time in class to play with it and manage it. And I'd say, and you just have to pull out quotes, images, hyperlinks, and menus at the top of the bottom, which they don't always do. Even the best of them don't always do it. And that's been really helpful. But I dropped a link in the chat to our Wix templates, and these are open source. But now we meet with faculty who are part of our institute or faculty that just want one, and we build it for their class or for their major, and that gives them a lot more control. We have no idea how this is going to work.
Yeah.
It seems to work okay at the class level, but so much of ePortfolios is about the teacher more than it is about the student and the way that they roll it out. And I have not figured out what the magic sauce is, but sometimes it goes better than others. But the one thing that's coming back is no one looks at a APA paper and says, when are you going to use this again? No one looks at a poster and says, well, when are you going to show that again? Or a PowerPoint. And ePortfolios have been held to this very different standard. And I think Helen and Christina both commented on why, and there's a lot of reasons why. But in reality, this is a pedagogical tool in a course or in a program or with a particular project or in another scenario. And when you explain to students that they're going to have more than one and they can just link them together with screenshots and hyperlinks, or if they're embarrassed of it, they could just turn it off, right? But the idea is that they're very functional and they don't need to be onerous, and it doesn't have to take 30 hours of extra work. In fact, I first started ePortfolios in a class because people were getting so frustrated with Word and Google and other softwares they were using to lay out a large recommendation report, and they didn't have enough control. And websites gave them control and less time and a more polished final piece to share with community clients.
Yeah. And I think part of that is encouraging, training, I don't know what the word is, students, that this is not like your assessment, you hand it in and it's finished. And that, I think, is something that we need to get across, and I don't know how, but programmatic, as Jerry is talking about, programmatic use of ePortfolios, I think it'd be is really powerful, and I've never been able to get into it because nobody else wants to do it.
So Sue, maybe on that note, then, I mean, the value of the portfolio after they finish the program, right? Like, is it, and maybe it speaks to what Savisil talked about in her keynote in terms of that intrinsic motivation or the ownership in the agency, not necessarily of the portfolio in the format that we needed it for our programs, like for assessment or accreditation, but the components of it that they can then repurpose as they're trying to tell the story to a different audience, of employers or admissions for graduate school, whatever it might be. Increasingly, as you may know, I do work with our career education, center here at Stanford. And increasingly, I think when I talk with students about portfolios, I say, this is my pitch to them, which is, some of the most important decisions in our professional lives are made when we're not in the room. But the thing is, there is someone in the room. And so as you tell the story about who you are, on one hand, it's about you, but it's also not about you, and that you're trying to help someone else understand you well enough so that they can advocate for you. They can pitch when you're not there. And so what can you create that's going to help them tell your story? You can imagine, like, if you're a graduate student or, a PhD student doing, very detailed, research, that story is more challenging to communicate, but you do need someone to be able to understand it, so that they can channel you when you're not there. And so recently Stanford held the 3-minute thesis competition, which I think originated in Queensland. And, and it was a great example of this being able to kind of represent, how do you tell the story about your research in 3 minutes to an educated lay audience? And I just love those examples, and they record them. Those students can include them in their portfolios. But, that sort of framing, I think, does seem to resonate, in terms of, why am I doing this? Why is this valuable? Why is it important that not only that I understand my story, but someone else understands my story?
Yeah. And it's been successful. I mean, you've got examples of students that have really embraced this and gone, I want to actually really work with this all through my career, change it, curate it, all that sort of thing.
They get the why. I think that
Yes.
that helps to understand the why. And so, and then again, maybe it's portfolio, maybe it's, LinkedIn, maybe it's that, how they, when someone asks them like, so what do you do? Tell me, why how'd you become a mechanical engineer? Or why are you interested in studying medicine? Kind of thing. They can understand, why am I saying this? And it provides a different vantage point when they say, like, it's not just like, I could go on for like 10 minutes talking about my research and stem cells and things like that, but that's not gonna help me, right? And especially, I think in this day and age, when students are so concerned, how am I going to get a job? How do I get over the AI? Like I use AI to craft my resume and my cover letter, and then it's going to go into an applicant tracking system where it's also the companies are using AI. So it's going to be like bot against bot. So then how do I get beyond that? Well, it's going to be through informational interviews, making that human to human connection. Like, I think if they could just get in front of a human, they'll be okay. Like, but can they get there? Who knows?
Yeah. The importance of storytelling too.
Yes.
And, your story, and to a wide audience.
Yes.
Like, of course, you're going to try and go for your discipline, but you also might need to, have other opportunities where you need to go broader than that narrow channel.
For sure. And and again, I mean, we've talked about this before, for jobs and careers that don't exist right now. We don't know what's going to happen with like the employment landscape. And so whatever we prepare them for post-grad, they're going to have to do over and over again. I mean, maybe we're all in that position at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Helen. That's great.
Any final comment or question for Sue? Or Sue, do you want to ask one more question?
I don't have another question, because I think what you've given me is really good, and I really believe in the power of peer support, peer comments, but getting over the barrier of implementing it. I know that some people have a resistance to implementing peer review and peer commentary. Students sometimes have that barrier, because they think, well, they're not experts, but they are, because they're experiencing the same thing. So I'm trying to, I would like to implement that. So that's my final comment, and I really appreciate everybody's staying awake so late, and listening to me go on and giving me all that feedback. It's really good, and hopefully I can implement it with the upper echelons, and actually get some of it implemented. So thank you very much for your time and your contributions.
And thank you, Sue, for bringing the topic to the conference so that we had an opportunity to enter into this exchange, to see, well, what is being done at other institutions like the Ohio State University, Indiana University, Indianapolis, also Stanford University, and everybody else who was in the room, so that we can talk about that and not just hear presentations, but really enter this idea exchange and get some more resources.